Over 2,500 years ago, Aristotle explained that people create new ideas from old ideas. Since there are no new ideas under the sun, creativity consists of bringing old ideas together in new ways. To that extent, exclusive intellectual property and the fundamental purpose of copyright are inherently flawed. Take the evolution of the telephone. Each subsequent product was built using ideas based on the previous version. It's not like the iPhone up and appeared one day. Steve Jobs had about 150 years of evolutionary inspiration to draw upon. When can one take ideas, art, music, or intellectual property as inspiration, and when does one need to pay for the copyright? You may be surprised. What is copyright? Copyright is the owner's legal right to reproduce, display, transmit, or modify work they have created. It's a type of author's right, called intellectual property. Copyright law involves three parties: individual creators, the publishers or distributors of creative works, and users or consumers of these works. The purpose of copyright. Historically, the purpose of copyright was not to monetarily protect creators and inventors. As referenced in the U.S. Constitution, the true goal of copyright protection was to encourage the dissemination of information to the masses. The intellectual property rights provision in the U.S. Constitution was designed to encourage the development of new ideas and information that will benefit society as a whole. Information that will benefit society as a whole. I want you to remember that point. It is the most important detail protecting our ability to manipulate copyrighted material. Copyright confusion. A lack of formal training, misinformation, and biased educational guidelines are some of the more common reasons for copyright confusion. We have discovered to our chagrin that copyright confusion affects the spread of innovative instructional practices, limits access to high-quality teaching materials, and perpetuates misinformation. This is a common example that you'll hear in a school. I heard it from a teacher who got a memo from another teacher who read it in an email that you could actually get in trouble for using videos in the classroom. There's a lot of confusion present. See no evil. Many teachers wrongly believe that fair use entitles them to use any type of copyrighted material for any use as long as it is, broadly speaking, for educational and non-commercial purposes. It's like an ostrich with its head in the sand. Ignorance is bliss. With fair use, the sky's the limit. That is not correct. People can use anything they want if they don't make a profit off it. That is not correct. The close-the-door policy, Section 110-1, allows educators to use lawfully made copies of copyrighted material in the classroom or a similar place devoted to instruction for educational purposes. Although educators are permitted to make a copy of a printed article, use a school-purchased DVD, use a privately purchased copy of a DVD, use an off-air tape movie, or use a rental DVD like Netflix. The problem is that the close-the-door policy limits the distribution of new and innovative instructional to the classroom and prohibits their sharing outside the classroom. Hyper-comply. The educator overregulates the classroom for fear of litigation or negative repercussions. In this case, the educator may be too afraid to use any material other than that explicitly provided by and approved by their school district. They may be receiving misinformation from administrators who may not be informed and are consequently encouraging only the use of board-approved curricular materials. The problem with educational use guidelines. Educational use guidelines and fair use law are not synonymous. Lawyers from large media outlets and publishing houses met with lawyers from various educational groups. Although the two sides were not equal in funding or expertise, they were able to reach an agreeable consensus as to what educational entities could utilize without breaking copyrights. The result was the creation of a confusing chart that had very little meaning in the eyes of the courts. From the very beginning, when the lawyers for publishing companies got together with the lawyers from various educational groups to clarify fair use, Congress clearly stated that these documents would not replace the fair use doctrine and would not be included in the actual law. In copyright infringement cases, the courts will base their decisions on the law itself, not guidelines. Copyright confusion comes when people confuse the doctrine of fair use with educational use guidelines. The consequences of copyright confusion. The reality of the confusion is that people are afraid and misinformed. One teacher was told by her school librarian that she would be personally liable for copyright violations and the school would not protect teachers if there was a lawsuit. The cause of the confusion is that teachers craft assignments that use technology and copyrighted materials explicitly for the classroom. The confusion and fear of litigation prevents the sharing of creative projects and teaching tools with peripheral audiences. So here it is, the Fair Use Act. 4 factors are considered when determining whether or not a particular use is fair. 1. The purpose and character of the use, including whether such use is of commercial nature or is for non-profit educational purposes. 2. The nature of the copyrighted work. 3. The amount and substantiality of the purpose used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. 4. The effect of the use upon the potential market for or value of the copyrighted work. This distinction between fair use and infringement may be unclear and not easily defined. There is no specific number of words, lines, or notes that may safely be taken without permission. Acknowledging the source of the copyrighted material does not substitute for obtaining permission. Fair use explained. The fair use doctrine is not just for educators, it applies to everyone. For example, it allows individuals to make music and movie compilations. Context and situation determine how fair use applies. We can think of fair use as a user's right because without such exemption, we'd have to pay a royalty for everything we touched. In many cases, people do not need to ask permission or pay a license fee in order to use a copyrighted work. People must make a fair use determination by considering the facts of the situation with sound reasoning and judgment. New instructional practices. The fair use doctrine is a much more flexible and powerful tool than is given credit for. What makes the use fair isn't so much the context of the use, but the nature of the use. The key that unlocks the doctrine of fair use is the idea of transformativeness. Transformativeness is the term emerging for the repurposing of copyrighted materials as part of the creative process. That is, has the user added value or repurposed the work? Instead of relying on lawyers to tell us what is and what is not fair use, educators and students need to make that determination for themselves. That's what the copyright law both permits and requires. Understanding transformative use. The ultimate test of fair use is whether the copyright law's goal of promoting the progress of science and useful arts would be better served by allowing the use than by preventing it. Does the use benefit the social collective group more than it impacts the copyright holder? That is the question to determine fair use. For example, just because the New York Times charges some educators for use of their articles does not prevent everyone from making copies for use in the classroom. Fair use is designed to promote all forms of creativity. Interpreting transformativeness. There are two questions to consider for fair use. Did the unlicensed use transform the material taken from the copyrighted work by using it for a different purpose than that of the original, or did it just repeat the work for the same intent and value as the original? 2. Was the material taken appropriate in kind and amount, considering the nature of the copyrighted work and of the use? Interpretation is subjective, not objective. The reasoning process of fair use relies on the concept of good faith in the absence of certainty. It's important to articulate your reasoning and be able to explain it to others. The issue of market impact. When using other works, it is important to only take what is needed to accomplish the goal and to make certain the synergetic result is a new product rather than a copy of the original. You should answer two questions. 1. How will my use of the materials affect the copyright owner's ability to profit from their work? 2. Will my use of this work cause excessive economic harm to the copyright owner? Making copies for whom, for what purpose? Reproductibles are materials created for student use. Many reproductibles take imagination, creativity, and hard work. Others are very plain and uninspiring. Purchasing a book and making copies of a small selection for students is acceptable and encouraged. However, copying the entire book and sharing it with all the teachers in the school is not acceptable and a violation of copyright law. The first sale doctrine. The Copyright Act of 1976 says that when you buy a legally produced copyrighted work, you can sell or loan that copy to others. The first sale doctrine allows the purchasing of copyrighted materials and subsequent copies for personal and professional gain. However, it is not fair use to make copies so the other educators can avoid purchasing the copyrighted material. That act would deprive the original author of revenue. Be reasonable to good faith defense. Fair use cannot be reduced to a checklist. Fair use requires that people think. Therefore, there is a legal clause to alleviate a user who acted reasonable and in good faith in light of accepted practices in their field. In the case a user acted reasonably and in good faith, statutory damages will be reduced to zero. This provision applies only if the infringer was an employee of a nonprofit educational institution, a library, or an archive, and was acting within the scope of his or her employment. It is tough to find a case where an educational employee or student was found guilty of copyright law infringement because the 1976 copyright law broadly enables the use of copyrighted materials for educational purposes. Key points to qualify for fair use status. 1. Make certain you transform the copyrighted material into a new creative entity. 2. Do not purchase copyrighted material and share it so that others can avoid purchasing the material. If so, you have impacted the economic ability of the owner. That is not permitted. 3. Make sure you are acting within the reasonable job requirements of a nonprofit educational entity. 4. Finally, and most importantly, the specific use of copyrighted works should benefit society more than it hurts the copyright holder. Code of Best Practices for Educators. The Code of Best Practices in Fair Use for Media Literacy Education are the most appropriate guidelines to make certain educators use copyrighted material appropriately and within the context of the law. Educators can 1. Make copies of newspaper articles, TV shows, and other copyrighted works and use them and keep them for educational use. 2. Create curriculum materials and scholarship that contain embedded copyrighted materials. 3. Share, sell, and distribute curriculum materials that contain embedded copyrighted materials. Learners can use copyrighted works in creating new materials, and 2. Distribute their works digitally if they meet the transformativeness standard. Future copyright. 3 potential outcomes. 1. Creative Commons. Promotes itself as the best of both worlds, protects and encourages collaborative transformativeness. 2. A grassroots movement to reclaim fair use. Weaken digital rights management, DRM, and the DWCA law of 1998 that infringes upon fair use. 3. Abolish copyright law. Sounds nice, but not likely. I will leave you with a famous quote of Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis. The general rule of law is that the noblest of human productions, knowledge, truths ascertained, conceptions, and ideas become, after voluntary communication to others, free as the air to common use.